Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, Eclectic Reads. I have 4 books to talk about that I finished in the last few weeks. So the first book that I finished was I, Claudius by Robert Graves. I first read this book about a decade ago, and I remember indicating in my review, this was a written review in a blog that I used to have, that is now privatized. I remember writing that this was one of my favorite books of the year, but I also remember really struggling with it. I wished, and I still do, that there was a family tree of the Julian Claudian dynasty in the book that I could continuously reference while I was reading it. So I enjoyed it, but I also know that I didn't understand a lot of it. But recently, I watched the 1976 BBC miniseries, I, Claudius, and loved it. In this series, Derek Jacobi plays Claudius, Sean Phillips plays Livia, and Patrick Stewart plays Sejanus, who was Tiberius's right-hand man. And this miniseries was wonderful. I binge watched it over a weekend, so that's a lot of episodes in a short amount of time. But it was great because I could follow all of the characters, and it really brought the story to life. So I highly recommend watching the miniseries, perhaps even before reading the books, if you're struggling with understanding the relationship between all the different characters and the action. After watching the miniseries, I decided to reread I, Claudius, and this time I understood all of it. This story tells the history of the Julian Claudian dynasty from the perspective of Claudius, who is writing a series of histories about his family. At the heart of this story, at least for the first half of the book, is Livia. Livia, who married Augustus and really pushed for him to become an emperor with hopes of having her son, or at least one of her sons, and eventually it's Tiberius, become his successor. And so anybody who gets in the way of that, she bumps off. She is such a compelling figure. She is this villain that you just love reading about. What I thought this book did really well was balance the scandals of the Julian Claudian dynasty, particularly with Livia, Tiberius, and Caligula, with an interesting meditation about the purpose of history. At one point in the story, Claudius is confronted by 2 historians. One is very famous, Livy, and the other one was famous in his day, but unfortunately his history hasn't survived, and that is Pollio. Livy and Pollio disagree about the purpose of history writing, whereas Livy writes about heroes in a way that promotes virtue. Pollio believes in writing about history as it happened, even if that means presenting his heroes in a less than positive light. Claudius clearly adopts more of Pollio's style of writing history, which is what makes this book so interesting, because he's airing the dirty laundry for sure. But it also got me thinking about the role of a historian and, what is their duty to society. This part of the story is not in the miniseries, which I think is actually the miniseries' strength. It knows what it's able to do, which is to portray all of the scandals, and also what it can't do. This is also the reason why one of the main conflicts in this book is in Germany, with Germanicus, who was Claudius's brother. He is trying to, frankly, exterminate the Germans. That campaign is discussed in quite a lot of detail in this book, whereas that is left out in the miniseries. And I think that was also for the best. If you want an excellent historical fiction novel, I highly recommend I, Claudius, and I can't wait to read the second book in the duology, Claudius the God, which I have on my shelf. You might be able to see somewhere back here. Oh, there it is. Claudius the God. By the way, I decided to include this book on my summer book bingo challenge as a book with yellow on the cover, because it has yellow on the cover. This is, by the way, the cover. This is from the miniseries. I rated it 4.5 stars, I think. The next book I want to talk about is Flush by Virginia Woolf. And this fulfilled the challenge of reading a book with a one-word title. This is probably going to be one of the best books I read this entire year. Flush tells the story of a Cocker Spaniel, as if it were the biography of an illustrious Victorian. But the story is also about Elizabeth Barrett, the poet, who was gifted this Cocker Spaniel by Mary Mitford, who was a writer as well. At the beginning of the story, Flush is a puppy, and he is, as I just mentioned, gifted to Elizabeth Barrett, Miss Barrett, who was an invalid because she had some kind of an illness. And so she was living in her own room. She was barely ever able to get out. And when she did, she was, constantly being monitored by her father and her brother, who have a huge hold on her life. But she still finds a way to be independent, writing these letters to Robert Browning, whom she eventually marries. But we see all of this through the perspective of a dog. And a dog doesn't really see the world with sight so much as with scent and touch. And so this gives us a really interesting perspective on Barrett's life as well as on London. Usually, when we think about London, we think about what we see. We don't think about the smells and the feel of London. But that really comes through in this book. I love the jealousy that Flush experiences when Robert Browning comes into Miss Barrett's life. I loved also the commentary in this book about women and women's experiences, especially women writers. And it made me really want to learn more about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, an author I never knew anything about before. This is more of a straightforward book. So if you've read Mrs. Dalloway and that didn't work for you, I would highly recommend reading Flush because it is more of a straightforward novel. I will say that at the end of the book, Flush does die, but it is not a tragic death. This is not an old Yeller ending. This is a death after a wonderful long life, and he dies next to his owner. And I just thought it was a beautiful ending to just a fabulous story. I really hope to read everything by Virginia Woolf because I've read Mrs. Dalloway multiple times. I've read Orlando and now Flush, and I have loved all of these books. 5 stars. And by the way, I have, right here, the collected poems of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Aurora Lee is the main poem, which is referenced in Flush. Next, I want to talk about Cattail, The Wild Weird Battle to Save the Florida Panther by Craig Pittman. I love reading books about animals. I have seen nearly every episode of every vet show that is out there. I support AZA accredited zoos and aquariums. I am particularly interested in conservation. And so this year, I definitely want to make a video about my favorite books about wildlife conservation, and Cattail will definitely be on there. This book is about the efforts in the last 50 years to bring the Florida panther back from the brink of extinction. Craig Pittman has written other books about Florida, and he has a very particular sense of humor that doesn't appeal to everybody. I learned that reading the Goodreads reviews, but it definitely works for me as somebody who is quite sarcastic. I will, in a moment, read you a passage from the book, and then you can decide for yourself if this tone works for you. At the heart of the story is a panther recovery effort in the Everglades, which was being paved over by different developers, and the efforts to protect this region for the Florida panther, which is a subspecies of the puma. I will say that Craig Pittman doesn't do enough, in my view, to explain what makes the Florida panther different than the puma, which is also referred to as a mountain lion or a cougar. At one point in the story, the Texas cougar is introduced into Florida, and that is to help the panther population. So obviously, they are very closely related if they can hybridize. There is this man named McBride, who was initially a panther hunter, but he started using his tactics to help with the recovery effort. And so he would use his hunting dogs to tree the panther so that the scientists could then tranquilize and tag the panther and follow his or its movements. I thought it was really interesting to not only see how this project ran, but also the politics of conservation. If you want a book to understand all of the politics, all of the resistance, all of the ways in which people in the Fish and Wildlife Agency could be bought by developers, this is the book to read. There is a very shady scientist whose last name was Mayer. He initially started out as a supporter of the recovery effort, but then eventually he became a consultant to various housing developers and used his shady science to support them. This is a book that will make you feel all of the emotions, particularly rage. But also, I just loved following this book. And there are some photos in the middle of this book. And I liked how the photos were organized because I could read through the photos and remind myself about what I had just read. So it was a good summary of this book. And now for the passage I was telling you about. Craig Pittman is talking about how the panthers, because their natural landscape was being paved over, they were feasting on people's pets. Soon, panthers were taking chihuahuas, chickens, goats, and anything else they caught out in the open. Especially goats. They love goats, the way Sesame Street's Cookie Monster loves chocolate chip cookies. There are a few instances of this kind of humor throughout the book, and I loved it. So I gave this book 4 stars. Wonderful. And the final book I want to talk about is a book that is becoming a little bit more popular on BookTube, and that is Leonard and Hungry Paul by Ronan Hession. This book is about 2 men who live with their families in their mid-30s. Recently, I finished a book called For the Love of Men by Liz Plank, which talks about toxic masculinity and its harmful effects on men. And one of the consequences of toxic masculinity is that men don't often form intimate friendships. Sure, they will play together, they will watch football together, but they don't really talk about themselves. And this does lead to the male loneliness epidemic I'm sure you've heard about. So this book is quite refreshing in that it focuses on the intimate friendship between 2 men. While Leonard and Hungry Paul both live with their families, unfortunately at the beginning of the book, Leonard loses his mother. And so for the first time, he has to live by himself. He had a wonderful relationship with his mother. They both respected each other's independence, but they also would play games together. Leonard works for a publishing company that produces children's encyclopedias, and he is the ghostwriter. He writes these very boilerplate encyclopedias that are meant to feature the work of illustrators, more so than focus really on the histories themselves. And he dreams of being able to write his own children's books. He's quite a nerd himself. And he's okay, though, with his work. He likes what he does. He doesn't really dream of becoming big and famous. And his friend, Hungry Paul, whom in my view reads as autistic, doesn't have really a career. He's a substitute postal worker. So he will fill in some Mondays every month whenever there's a postal worker who's absent. But otherwise, he does his own stuff. He has his own special interests. He likes playing games. He's also doing judo. In the beginning of the story, when we meet him for the first time, he's dressed in a bathrobe that he's using in replace of like an actual like judo robe. And that made me laugh so hard. Hungry Paul, more so than Leonard, like doesn't care at all about what society views as success. And this really disappoints his sister, Grace, who is in the process of getting married and really is worried about Hungry Paul and whether she's going to have to take care of him after her parents die. Now, her parents are far from death, and her parents really support Hungry Paul. They really encourage him. And we can see that he is contributing a lot to society in his own quiet way. I thought that this was a beautiful story. It is really not a traditional novel. It's more like a series of vignettes about these 2 men. And I hope that Ronan Hession writes books about Leonard and Hungry Paul, maybe individually, so that we can follow their journeys, because they do end up doing and accomplishing things in their own way. I would say its greatest weakness is in the portrayal of Grace. I felt like this novel was more of what in French is called a roman de thèse, or a thesis novel, where the author has this really strong moralistic message, and Grace is clearly like the villain in the story. Like, she's supposed to be someone we dismiss as having views that are just really capitalist, and she doesn't really understand her brother. But I also wish that she was a more nuanced character, that we could really sympathize with her, because as the older sister, and I am an older sister, I could think about the heavy weight that she has maybe taken upon herself, or maybe has been placed on her by society, and the real fears that she has, that she's going to have to take care of her brother. And even if we love Hungry Paul and support his journey, I can also understand where she was coming from, and I just wish that the narrator was more sympathetic toward her, and we really don't get that sympathy in the book. And so ultimately, Grace is not a very interesting character, and that was the book's greatest weakness. So I gave this book 3.5 stars. I look forward to reading other things by Hessian. I know there's another novel, Panenko, that also has received a lot of great praise. So those are the 4 books that I've read. I did also read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson, but I made an entire in-depth review of that book. There is an entire spoiler-free section as well as a spoilery section to that video, so I will link that down below. I have a book tag I still need to make. I also want to make a response video to a video I saw recently that was really interesting, and so you can look forward to that. If you aren't already subscribed and you like the vibes here, please consider subscribing. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.